show, and then we can just go through each work and talk a little bit about how that fits into the larger theme of the work. So just very quickly, when Cassandra asked me to look at to curate and to look at the permanent collection, I knew basically I knew it had to have an environmental or landscape theme or have some connection in that respect. But the collection for Octa's collection is really fantastic. And so as I start to look through works, one of the preferred, there's two pieces. One of them, which unfortunately we weren't able to include in the show, but we have an alternate, which is there's a Viola Fry piece and Jacob Lawrence. And while those don't, their surface seem to have, they wouldn't be probably your first choice as to think about what a landscape show is. I guess I start to, at some point, think more specific about landscape than environment. And those are different words which we could talk about as we go through. But then as I start to look through the collection, what happened was the works that popped out to me started to create a picture of what can happen in an exhibition, and themes start to arise from that. And so the idea is, and this is something that Camille and I talked about on Saturday, which is really trying to change the way in which we think about things like landscape, nature, environment. So on Saturday, if you weren't here, both Camille and I talked about this idea that the word nature kind of gets in the way of us actually being ecological thinkers, because nature suggests that there's a separation between humans are somehow here and everything else is nature. And that separation has caused a great deal of imbalance ecologically, socially, economically. So when I start to think about this piece in particular, so this is from a series that Jacob Lawrence called the Black Belt, and he did it for Fortune magazine. And so if you don't know about Jacob Lawrence's, the most famous piece he did is his migration series, which is 60 pieces that chronicle the migration of African Americans from the south to the north, and really well researched. And so he did another version of this. And so the Black Belt is the term for the area along the south, which is where all these African American communities were kind of they're sort of basically penned into this place, and that's where where they were able to work. So this is connected to this history of not only slavery but emancipation and to Reconstruction. So this is telling a story about people who work the land, but they are not allowed to be on the land. And so when I start to think about this, the two of the themes, or a couple of the big themes that arise from the show are there are bodies in the land, and they're absolutely essential to understand what is happening in the land, and that there are power structures which make it so that certain things can be seen, certain things have certain people have access and others don't. So just very quickly to talk about the Langston Hughes, this came after I chose the poem and the title after I chose the works, and the poem is in an anthology that Camille Dungy had edited called Black Nature. And when I taught a class at Pacific Northwest College of Art for about 12 years called Homeland, the American Landscape, which a lot of the themes from that class I realize are now here. I used that book because while I was teaching the class, I realized all the material I'm finding is about white men going into the land. And that's not the whole story. So that was an essential book, and so this is in there, and I thought it was perfect because in the poem, it's an earth song, right? So if you think about landscape as a term, environment, those are really abstract, they're really removed. They speak to a mindset that talks about analyzing to standing back, this is inhabiting. And so that I wanted to talk about an inhabited landscape. And again, going back to the idea of the term nature. So I've been trying to substitute the word nature for some a little more clunky, but it's the living world. Because nature, that means that we're part of it. That means like all the microflora in our guts, all the things floating around, that's all part of it. We're all connected and we're all part of it. So these two pieces, and then the Viola Fry, the piece that the sculpture was one called Surprise Group. So Viola Fry, if you don't know her, really important, but it's starting to get a little more recognition, but somewhat overlooked ceramic artist who was part of that generation of the 60s and 70s that included Peter Voulkos and Robert Arneson. She was part of the Bay Area. And she was, under 5 feet tall, absolute powerhouse, and she'd do these giant sculptures. Many of them were these kind of angry men in suits, and they were kind of like standing like this over you, or women in these kind of flowery dresses, kind of referring back to her childhood. But the sculpture that we didn't pick, and in this one, this is as we walk through, I'll talk about things that I originally wanted that we couldn't do for one reason or another, and then the substitute becomes better. And I think that's how shows work. So this one is like the swimmer, but she's swimming in this, in all this detritus, and there's all of this stuff around her. And so I think of these two being about this idea of in a living world that's controlled on some level by certain power systems. These bodies don't get to inhabit the land. This one is impacted by the fact that everything's flooding, everything's coming through. Most people wouldn't necessarily put these two together. And so I guess I could also, as we're walking, talk a little bit about my eye, which comes out of the studio practice. Because in that gallery you see paintings and drawings, but I'm also a ceramicist, so I have a connection to ceramics and looking at them in that sense. So again, so just really quickly, the main theme of this, which is why it's inverted, usually if you see a title, it would be landscape with figures. So the landscape being the primary subject, of the figure being diminished. I flipped that so we can see that these are about the people in the landscape. And I won't do this because, as I said, I taught this class for 12 years, so I'm not going to keep you here for like 3 hours talking about this, but just in landscape history, the history of landscape painting or landscape images, it actually comes out of the tradition, or out of a time when Europe was really really started to colonize the world, and there were certain lands laws throughout in England and in the Netherlands and here, as we're developing land laws that talk about private ownership. So there really is a connection between the land and private ownership, and if you look at, Thomas Cole is probably the most important American landscape painter. Even there's certain paintings he does where it's just the landscape, and this is the sublime landscape, and he always puts these little indications of the work or the taming of the landscape and the loss of the indigenous people. I mean, it's not, he doesn't do it enough where it's overt, but you can feel that there's a kind of regret already in 1830 in what these landscapes are speaking to, but we're stuck with that language. So why don't we actually move around this way? Because there's individual works, and then there's rooms, and there's connections between the rooms that we could talk about. So let's start with here.